you are focused on yourself. You're working on yourself. But you're working on yourself in order to get over yourself. and this kind of thing is not really self-obsessive. Yeah, you need what is the process of contemplative prayer? It's basically sitting in silence for 20 minutes in the morning and 20 minutes in the evening, or using the Jesus prayer. I mean, very simply. And I don't think that that's necessarily selfish. That's usually just what one needs to do for one's own sanity. For example, the hermits who withdraw even from the monasteries, not out of selfishness or out of hatred of community or the brothers, but because they're so overflowing with love that their compassion becomes a distraction. And so they deal with people one at a time instead of en masse.
It's interesting.
Yeah. And those are the real hermits. And they're the crazy old guys, who are just, but this is the kind of thing that, on one hand, is very solitary, but it opens one up in a deep way. Now and it does that fairly quickly, as a matter of fact. In a sense, what it does is it opens up vulnerability very quickly. And so, as I said, you have to be really psychologically strong to undertake a very intense spiritual path. Because that vulnerability is on multiple levels. But really it does open one up to other people in a very broad way. And especially with what we're going to be talking about is dealing with resentments. Getting over those resentments is a profoundly other-centered. Leah, there's a spot right here.
Thank you. Oh, there is one here.
Okay. So what we're talking about ultimately is getting over ourselves, getting through the refuse of the passions and the effects of the passions that actually isolate us from one another and keep us imprisoned in our selfish agendas. The passions are selfish agendas. And one of those that is perhaps the most difficult to deal with on one hand, and yet is profoundly life-giving and leads to the most radical freedom, is to deal with our resentments. Now, some people have led lives without much abuse, physical, mental, or psychological, and other people, like the woman who was cited after 20 years and so have been just horrifically abused. And it's very hard so this process should only be undertaken with a close relationship with the spiritual father, because what it demands is frequent confession. Because what the process of purification is about is it's confronting your own sins, owning them, in other words, accepting responsibility for them, repenting of them, in other words, accepting contrition, you know, being contrite and turning away from them, confessing them, and accepting forgiveness. So that confession is a very critical part of this. Now, some of our sins are of our own volition and external. And we all know what those are. Each one of us have our own unique set, usually which repeat themselves endlessly. You know, we could probably have a confession list printed out on the computer, and just every time we go, right? It's always the same. Again and again, you know. We're the church of again and again, Paki. But one of the key elements in this is to confront not just our own kind of surface level sins and transgressions, but those things that are deeper in our soul, which cause all sorts of thoughts and ideas, some of which create thoughts and from the memories of how people have abused us, by which we've come to define ourselves. We've either accepted their abusive criticisms of us and define ourselves according to those, or we have or we have become, or we have been victims of other people's sins and passions. But it's important to remember that we have reacted as well. And while we're not responsible if somebody abused us for their abuse, and this is very, very important, we never, ever, ever deserve to be abused. No one ever has the right to abuse another person. This is very important. If somebody, very often when we become caught in a cycle of abuse, abusive relationships or something, and we justify it. Now, in contemporary psychological language, this is called codependency. That we say, oh, I brought it on myself. I irked him on. I tempted him or something like that. No, doesn't matter. It doesn't matter what you did. If somebody has mistreated you, they have mistreated you, and that's their sin. Now, what you've done with that is your responsibility. And and I won't say naturally, but in our fallen naturalness, our reactions to other people's abuse of us are also sinful. But what's important is that we take responsibility for our own reaction so that we can deal with that, we can repent of it, and we can be free of it. And that way we can let the other person who abused us deal with his own stuff. It's not mine to deal with. If he abused me, that's his problem, and I want to let it be his problem, because the more we take responsibility for another person's abuse or mistreatment of us, the more we're controlled by it. And usually the last thing we want is, if somebody has abused us, is for them to have control over us. So it's very, very important to be able to make the distinction between what the other person has done to us and how we reacted to it. So somebody hits me, I'm going to be angry. I might hit back. I might cuss them out if I'm really hurt. it's going to cause all sorts of things. But then there's the more psychological level. I'm going to feel humiliated and ashamed, and my pride is going to be hurt, and I'm probably going to have some despondency over it, unless I beat him up in exchange, and then that's my sin. You know, and all of these other things, and so there's a whole complex of reactions to how somebody has abused us. Or another thing, say you get dumped by your girlfriend in high school, or your boyfriend, or whatever. Think of all of the emotional, psychological reactions. You know, think of in terms of the passions that evokes. So, you know, there's most likely lust involved, right? There's anger, there's jealousy, there's probably despondency. Your pride is hurt, your vainglory is hurt, right? And you're probably just a mess.
Sometimes vendetta, you know.
Yeah, exactly. Vendetta is bad. But if we look at it, we can see that, you know, there's all of these reactions. I mean, you are focused on yourself. You're working on yourself. But you're working on yourself in order to get over yourself. This kind of thing is not really self-obsessive. Yeah, you need what is the process of contemplative prayer? It's basically sitting in silence for 20 minutes in the morning, 20 minutes in the evening, or using the Jesus prayer. I mean, very simply. And I don't think that that's necessarily selfish. That's usually just what one needs to do for one's own sanity. For example, the hermits who withdraw even from the monasteries, not out of selfishness or out of hatred of community or the brothers, but because they're so overflowing with love that their compassion becomes a distraction. And so they deal with people one at a time instead of en masse.
It's interesting.
Yeah. And those are the real hermits. And they're the crazy old guys, who are just, but this is the kind of thing that, on one hand, is very solitary, but it opens one up in a deep way. Now and it does that fairly quickly, as a matter of fact. In a sense, what it does is it opens up vulnerability very quickly. And so, as I said, you have to be really psychologically strong to undertake a very intense spiritual path. Because that vulnerability is on multiple levels. But really it does open one up to other people in a very broad way. And especially with what we're going to be talking about is dealing with resentments. Getting over those resentments is a profoundly other-centered. Leah, there's a spot right here.
Thank you. Oh, there is one here.
Okay. So what we're talking about ultimately is getting over ourselves, getting through the refuse of the passions and the effects of the passions that actually isolate us from one another and keep us imprisoned in our selfish agendas. The passions are selfish agendas. And one of those that is perhaps the most difficult to deal with on one hand, and yet is profoundly life-giving and leads to the most radical freedom, is to deal with our resentments. Now, some people have led lives without much abuse, physical, mental, or psychological, and other people, like the woman who was cited after 20 years in Siberia, have been just horrifically abused. And it's very hard for the. So this process should only be undertaken with a close relationship with the spiritual father, because what it demands is frequent confession. Because what the process of purification is about is it's confronting your own sins, owning them, in other words, accepting responsibility for them, repenting of them, in other words, accepting contrition, being contrite and turning away from them, confessing them, and accepting forgiveness. So that confession is a very critical part of this. Now, some of our sins are of our own volition and external. And we all know what those are. Each one of us have our own unique set, usually which repeat themselves endlessly. We could probably have a confession list printed out on the computer, and just every time we go, right? It's always the same. Again and again, we're the church of again and again, Paki. But one of the key elements in this is to confront not just our own kind of surface level sins and transgressions, but those things that are deeper in our soul, which cause all sorts of thoughts and ideas, some of which create thoughts and from the memories of how people have abused us, by which we've come to define ourselves. We've either accepted their abusive criticisms of us and define ourselves according to those, or we have or we have become, or we have been victims of other people's sins and passions. But it's important to remember that we have reacted as well. And while we're not responsible if somebody abused us for their abuse, and this is very, very important, we never, ever, ever deserve to be abused. No one ever has the right to abuse another person. And this is very important. If somebody, very often when we become caught in a cycle of abuse, in abusive relationships or something, we justify it. Now, in contemporary psychological language, this is called codependency. That we say, oh, I brought it on myself. I irked him on. I tempted him or something like that. No, doesn't matter. It doesn't matter what you did. If somebody has mistreated you, they have mistreated you, and that's their sin. Now, what you've done with that is your responsibility. And I won't say naturally, but in our fallen naturalness, our reactions to other people's abuse of us are also sinful. But what's important is that we take responsibility for our own reaction so that we can deal with that, we can repent of it, and we can be free of it. And that way we can let the other person who abused us deal with his own stuff. It's not mine to deal with if he abused me. That's his problem, and I want to let it be his problem, because the more we take responsibility for another person's abuse or mistreatment of us, the more we're controlled by it. And usually the last thing we want is, if somebody has abused us, is for them to have control over us. So, so it's very, very important to be able to make the distinction between what the other person has done to us and how we reacted to it. So, somebody hits me, I'm going to be angry. I might hit back. I might cuss them out if I'm really hurt. It's going to cause all sorts of things. But then there's the more psychological level. I'm going to feel humiliated and ashamed, and my pride is going to be hurt, and I'm probably going to have some despondency over it, unless I beat him up in exchange, and then that's my sin. You know, and all of these other things, and so there's a whole complex of reactions to how somebody has abused us. Or another thing, say you get dumped by your girlfriend in high school, or your boyfriend, or whatever. Think of all of the emotional, psychological reactions. You know, think about in terms of the passions that evokes. So, you know, there's most likely lust involved, right? There's anger, there's jealousy, there's probably despondency. Your pride is hurt, your vainglory is hurt, right? And you're probably just a mess.
Sometimes it's vendetta, you know.
Yeah, exactly. Vendetta is bad. But if we look at it, we can see that, you know, there's all of these reactions that are my own responsibility, and whether, or say somebody just brutally just criticizes you and rips you apart and calls you all sorts of, you know, stupid and incompetent and on and on and on and on and on and on. What, on one hand, what's the reaction? You might just get angry and punch him out, or you might take it in and start believing it. And it's a lie, and especially if it's a lie. If it's not a lie, well, then that's another. But if it's a lie, you know, especially, you know, you're going to have, or you know, if it's slander, you're going to have even more different kinds of anger. You're going to have hurt pride. You're going to have hurt vainglory. Undoubtedly, despondency and depression are going to get in there. You're going to be angry. There may be some kind of jealousy or envy involved. So we have to. What we need to do is we need to go back, unfortunately, and look at these things, because what they're doing is generating thoughts. And what I mean is that if we're walking through the supermarket and we see the guy who, you know, see the person who abused us, and we start reacting, oh, I don't want to get near him, that guy is a so-and-so, they're evil, abusive, and on and on and on, or we become fearful, or we start having these strong reactions, emotional reactions. Then we know there's something deep going on within us, and what we need to do, is to go back and look at the situation and start pulling it apart. This is one of those areas where Alcoholics Anonymous has done tremendous work in identifying the how to deal with this interior pain, because Alcoholics Anonymous is not about it's only on the surface, like only the first step is really about alcohol, the first of the 12. The rest of it is about dealing with your resentments and learning how to become how to confess your sins and then become totally dependent on God. That's 12 steps. Well, that's nice. It's handy, but it all comes from the fathers. It all comes from the Greek fathers, because who the founders of AA were was they were faithful Anglicans who read the Nicene, Post-Nicene Fathers series, and especially all the works about how to deal with the passions. Well, the one thing, one of the major differences is that they have confession, but they don't have absolution. We got absolution, and that's very important. Because what is absolution? What is the sacrament of absolution? Is that it's an imparting of grace into the soul to heal the soul. Because when we confess, what are we doing? We're exposing a wound. And receiving the absolution, the grace comes in and heals the wound. It illumines and heals. Now, there's a process in confession, whether it's dealing either with the kind of day-to-day stuff or with the deeper stuff, is that, and especially in this process of purification, because what happens is we see some of this kind of inner garbage that's obscuring our soul, or it's like a room filled with junk, right? Well, you turn on the light in there, and you see the first layer. Okay? Then you get rid of it by confessing it. Much easier to do it by confessing it than by calling it a junk man. But you see the first layer, and then you confess it, and more light shines in. Well, it illumines the second layer. So you deal with that, and you confess it, and get rid of it, and it reveals the third layer. And goes on and on and on. And it depends on how big the room is and how much junk is in there. But that's really part of what this process is. So that what we can access is that inner vastness, inner space within us, so that we can encounter even a person who's abused us with no distraction and no reaction. And that's the goal. And that's called dispassion. But in order to get there, what we do is we have to deal with our sins, and especially these memories of evil, remembrance of wrongs, in other words, in some of the patristic literature, which we call resentments. Now, what happens? Somebody abuses us. We react. But part of that reaction is that we judge that person. That's kind of the first level. We judge them and we objectify them. We say, this is an evil, abusive, violent person. Dangerous. Nasty. Stay away. Now, that objectification of that person, that means that we've created a conceptual image of that person that may or may not have anything to actually do with that person, but only with maybe with their action. But we've objectified them according to their actions. We do. This is it's like ego form. It's the same thing like ego formation. We objectify ourselves according to our passions. Well, this is objectifying the other person according to their actions. And if it's an abusive action against us, it's going to have a really strong kind of energy to it. And then we relate not to the person themselves, but we relate to that objectification, to that conceptual image of that person, and so we fear them, and then we judge them, we hate them, we go over and over in our mind what they said or what they did against us, and we justify our reaction against them, we justify our hatred, we justify our rejection, we justify, right? Does it sound right? Mm-hmm. Okay. And pretty soon we've got this burning hatred supported by fear of that person, and we're not able to see the person for who they are. Now, this may, it may be, if it was something really horrible, this is going to be very strong. If it was something kind of mild, but still we took offense, it's not going to be as strong. But what we've done is we've completely depersonalized the other. And not only that, by allowing ourselves to turn again over and over again in our minds their actions or their words against us, we give them power over us. So that becomes almost a part of our own self-definition.
Not only possibly it does.
Yeah. I define myself by their criticisms of me. I'm defining myself by my victimhood. And this is a very dangerous place to be in, because it's not who you are. It moves from objectification of the other to objectification of self. And so in confronting it, we have to kind of roll back what happened. Okay, he did this to me. I reacted in this way. I'm not responsible for his actions, but I am responsible for my actions. And then what we can begin to do by repenting of that, of my own actions, my own sinful actions and reactions, is not only to gain more and more control over our own mind, because that's what it does. It will no longer, when we can repent of our own reactions against somebody who's hurt us, we no longer will turn over and over again in our minds what they've said or done to us, but we can begin to see them as a person who's also suffering and struggling, and open our heart to compassion. Yeah.
Sometimes I find it very, very easy to love anybody and everybody, and to cut them a break, because I'm cutting myself a break on a minute-to-minute basis.
Mm-hmm.
So there's a relativity
Mm-hmm.
involved in that. But I've noticed that the tipping point is if I think they're harming other people,
Mm-hmm.
too. So where you can say, oh well, this happened to me and this is how I'm going to adjust to this or whatever. when you start to see that, say they're hurting the church in some way, or they're hurting community in some way, they're hurting family in some way, they're hurting other people, then there's a tipping point. On the other hand, I think the basis of that is cutting yourself a break on a minute-to-minute basis.
Well, we got to cut ourselves a break on a minute-to-minute basis. On the other hand, you're not going to be able to deal with that person if you're reacting in a victim mode and out of fear and loathing. But once you've gotten beyond that, in other words, this is the process of forgiveness. Once you've gotten beyond and you've forgiven that person for their action and can overlook their sin and say, well, this person is, then maybe you can actually have enough of a personal contact with them to say, wait a second, what are you doing? You're caught in a pattern of behavior that's very damaging. But as long as you persist in this state of victimhood, you're not going to be able to relate to that person.
I'm talking about something where you're seeing other people as the victim.
Or yourself,
in other words,
especially.
Or say you were a victim or a perceived victim, or somebody tried to make you a victim or whatever.
Right.
And I guess you've understood how they were in their heart, or how you were, so on and so forth, and the you part of it is not there anymore. But you see that they're doing this to other people.
Mm-hmm.
Or it persists on a higher level, or they're still in a position of authority where they can hurt other people, or they're being enabled, or whatever.
Right.
And I think it's easy to disengage and vote with your feet and walk away and stuff like that. That's what I do a lot of. But a lot of it, I think, is because it's easy to forgive if you're forgiving yourself too much. In other words, if you're cutting yourself a break all the time, well, you're being relative about your own sin. It's easy to be forgiving.
Well, what I'm talking about is freeing.
It's easy to love,
Yeah, what I'm talking about is freeing yourself from their power. What you do with it then, if you perceive that they're hurting other people, is then you're in a position to deal with it. Because as long as you're in a victim mode, you're not.
When do we act?
Well, that's up to your discretion. But
When do we act when other people are being hurt? When do we act?
well,
It's always a difficult decision.
well, I think you need to take you need to take care of yourself first, so that you can act, and then you can get into then you can discern clearly, without vendetta and without vindictiveness, how best to address the situation, because vindictiveness is always evil. The question is how to act in a constructive manner, because we can act in all sorts of ways which are not constructive, but it's a good question. I don't want to get caught in that though right now. Okay. Because finally, ultimately, right now, what I'm talking about is our own personal spiritual path. Now, that may eventually involve defending others. But that's a different issue. Yeah.
You were talking, talking about when people have seriously offended us through abuse or some sort, but it could be something I can see also just where something as simple as somebody cuts you off as you're driving, and trying to avoid getting enraged by such things.
Well, that doesn't happen, does it?
No, that never happens in DC.
How about if you cut somebody off?
No, that never happens in DC. The Beltway is perfect. Where the roads around here, but just things like that where they can be momentarily, but it's hard, in trying to realize that, try not to remember, try to remember that, that as a person in that car, not thinking that there's, in objectifying, that person or what happened. And sometimes that can, just around here, that can be difficult. But there's other, things like that that are not necessarily abuse, but they may be very commonplace. So they may be very repetitive.
Sit on hands, making gestures.
Whereas, I'm just, I was thinking of things that are perhaps, a bit milder, but can still be, can just push the right button. So to
Right.
speak.
Well, I think one of the things, say you're driving and somebody cuts you off. Do you allow yourself to become enraged and honk your horn and in other words sit on your horn and start cussing them out and flip them the bird and all the rest of it, and they're 30 miles further down the road and you're still holding on to them. There's a story from the Desert Fathers about the two monks. He came to a riverbank and there's a woman there who needs to get across the river, and the one monk doesn't think anything of it, puts her up on his shoulders and gets her across the river. And the other monk, 5 miles down the road, says, "How could you have done that? It's a woman. You're a monk. You're not supposed to touch her." On and on and on. And the other monk says to him, "I left her back on the riverbank." Yeah, but you're still carrying her, and so we have to look at ourselves. In the first place, why do we allow ourselves to get enraged? Why do we allow ourselves to get angry, rather than just saying, okay, he cut me off. Well, that was dangerous.
Maybe there was a reason. Maybe the person was in a hurry somewhere. He was late. Instead of it's easy to say somebody's sins, but not your own. If you're not in a hurry and somebody's in a hurry, sometimes I relate to liturgy. I cut on people, but I say thank you. I hope they didn't cuss in me. Thank you. I do it all the time. And my husband said, I'm afraid some policemen come to the door and said it will be shut because somebody can stand it. I do it very often, but I always thank you people. I'm sorry. I'm late. I desperately need to be on time to liturgy. So when I'm not in a hurry and somebody cuts on me, I said, okay, maybe he's late somewhere, maybe he have to pick up child from daycare, will be charged. You have to get in the position of that person. It's all about don't seeing somebody's sins and seeing your sins. And easy to see somebody's sins always. Always easy to see somebody's sins.
Sure.
And it's all like prayer of, Syrian said give us to see our sins. And it's all about the great Lent about it. I know. And it's easy to see somebody's sins. Much easier.
But actually, why even engage it? Why even react to it?
Why is it not so spiritually hard?
This is what trying to move towards deep inner peace, so that people can do or say whatever, and you don't have to react.
Yeah, it's like not sponge. You're not taking it.
You don't have to react. Let them. They're going to do what people are going to do what they're going to do. We don't have to react. And it's that principle of non-reaction which actually is what's going to preserve our peace. Because if you allow yourself to get angry and you flip them the bird and you cuss them out you're all upset for the next 10 minutes, where's your peace? Where's your peace? But if you just just don't. In other words, don't react emotionally to it. Just recognize, this happened. Okay, that's that. It's hard. I'm not saying I'm any master of it by any means, but what we're aiming for is to try and get to a place where we can be where we can have that deep peace within ourselves, so that actually it will overflow to others. Yeah.
I think another big part of it is to keep things in perspective is, where your treasure is, there will your heart be. Right. And so when you consider the scheme of things, eternal salvation for yourself and for others around you, versus these petty things, so maybe it costs you 1 minute on the Beltway, is that worth jeopardizing your eternal, destiny? That's, I don't think, if you think about it rationally, it's not.
Yeah, or it's not. Usually, it's not even a minute. It's about 2 or 3 seconds. Mm-hmm. Like what gets me is pedestrians. Sometimes, it really got me the other day. This woman with a baby carriage I was the second car trying to turn left onto a street, and there was oncoming traffic, and she decides she's going to cross the street at that minute in front of the two oncoming cars. She got me. So, Leah.
How do you deal with a set of rules that are so popular in the nation that you almost understand that this is the set of rules in which they're being brought up in every family? And when you see that, for example, perhaps from childhood, people are taught to use cliche phrases to cover their own failings. Mm-hmm. Very simple. As an example, for example, if they forgot to fulfill your request, they will tell, "Oh, there was no opportunity." Mm. And that's like a standard phrase. It's like a button in the computer, because mm-hmm. they just use it all the time. Mm-hmm. But they will never confess that, "Oh, I'm so sorry, I forgot." Mm-hmm. Then if, for example, they are not inclined to keep engagement, a simple engagement, mm-hmm. for example, to meet somewhere, to drive somewhere, they can call you and say, "Oh, there is so much traffic, I don't think I can make it." And later you find out that they never even started the car. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, and these are just a couple of very simple examples, but what happens is I can go on mm-hmm. for an hour, which I don't want, of course, with these kind of examples. But what happens for a person who lives here and has been living here for very many years, it accumulates, and you see that there is a system of lies. Mm-hmm. And these people are converts. They go to your church, and occasionally you see them even going to confession. And please forgive my impertinence, but I also have very many Russian friends who occasionally would allow themselves to do something of that sort, but they would immediately call back and say, "Oh, you know what, please forgive me, I lied to you. I completely forgot about that, and the truth is this and this and this." Because this is included mm-hmm. in the Russian mind, mm-hmm. it is included in the struggle mm-hmm. that we're supposed to persevere mm-hmm. in with forgot. That's the right word to say. But what do you do? I mean, I understand Americans, okay, they're not converts, they don't belong to my church, they do that all the time. I don't take that at all deeply. But when Americans, whom you have known for 25 years, and they go to your church, they do the same thing. How do you keep yourself from not only noticing that, but how do you build a barrier so that, because these are small things, although they accumulate to lies and they become big things, and you think, how does this person go to confession if every 10 minutes of her 24 hours a day she lies, and she thinks it's not important because these are small things, cover-up things. But you know, they are taught to do that.
Right.
This is the way of good upbringing, because the girls are taught to be silent in a company before they catch a husband. When you don't know anything, you don't betray your ignorance, you just sit still there and be silent. I think it all starts with that. And then also there is this set of excuses that you come up with all your life until you're 90. And you use them all that. So what do you do? What do you do not to react, not to be shocked, not to analyze, and not take it in? Please.
Well, you basically, you recognize what's going on and you just let it go. Or you can confront them and say, why are you lying to me? But that usually won't work.
Yes.
Because there is a culturally ingrained thing. On the other hand, in other words, you don't judge them, because then that'll disturb your inner peace. That's the thing. You don't allow the other person's actions to disturb your inner peace, and you don't judge them, and just recognize, oh, this is one of their failings. Her today, me tomorrow, or me 10 minutes from now. But the other thing, and I think is really important, is that it's a huge discipline to be constantly brutally honest. In other words, moving the focus away from somebody else's actions against me, or words that are, because we can't, ultimately we can't control other people, and they're going to act how they're going to act. But what we can do is we can look at ourselves and be constantly asking ourselves, am I being honest in that? Am I making am I trying to put forth a false excuse, or am I going to be honest? And instead of saying, oh, the traffic was bad, I just say, I forgot, please forgive me.
Right.
And the more we can actually do that, or I misspoke, forgive me. I said something I shouldn't have. I did something that that hurt you, and I recognize it. Please forgive. The more we can live in this, in other words, be very conscious of our actions and our words, the more, the better it will be for us spiritually, because then we don't have this accumulation of lies and false statements, but we simply are being honest with ourselves and with other people.
But from what you've been teaching us to do just all these previous minutes, it is my reactions that I'm supposed to watch. So, okay, she is supposed to start her own honesty somewhere, but she is not, okay? For 25 years I see that, well, she is the same person. How do I shield myself from noticing that on everyday basis or every hour basis? Well, I have just arrived at one formula, and please correct me if I'm wrong. I just said to myself, okay, this is because of my terrible sins I'm put into this country to endure this. And that's it. And that's my payment. But you probably know better than this. This was all I could come up with.
No, it's just You know, I think there's a different cultural attitude towards that, but the reality is it's little white lies. And is it good? No. But do we need to react to it? No. And if somebody does it consistently, it's like seeing that they have a big blotch on their forehead. You know,
Yes.
and you recognize, okay, they have a big blotch on their forehead. Okay,
Sad.
I love them anyway. Just love them
Okay,
anyway.
okay, so what you love in them is the potential that was given to them by the Creator
Right.
to become perfect.
Right.
And you regretfully notice that they're doing this. Is that how you love them?
Yep.
Share with us.
Yep, that's it. That's it exactly. Just like when you see your own sins, you regret that I've got this blotch on, you know, you know, I've got this mole on my nose that makes me look like Rudolph, you know, the red-nosed reindeer, and I can't do anything about it, but or I could do something about it, but I'm not ready to, and I have to live with this, and it's ingrained habit. But the point is, I think on one hand, you know, we have to be very conscious of our words and our thoughts and how they actually affect other people. That's on one level, and on another level, it's to be able to overlook these little offenses without reacting to them.
Impersonal,
Yeah.
sort of to understand them as that person's tricks to shield herself.
Right,
Not directed to me, but to everyone else.
right. It's not personal.
One last question, please, if you allow me, in the same topic. Now, the last thing that I cannot struggle with, I don't understand how to start, is when you get upset, and I do get upset, when I see that, okay, this person is thinking of herself as deeply Orthodox, and has been going to the church for a long, long time. Now you start thinking, well, but okay, what about her spiritual father? Why does he neglect these things? Because I was taught by fathers of the church, and you can read in every great father of the church from the ancient centuries, that you start with small things. I was, for example, once and forever taught 20 years ago by Irmont Nikken, whom you know personally, extremely well, when I ate an egg during St. Paul's Lent. And it was sort of accidentally, because I was exhausted. I went to Lavra, I didn't eat for 20 hours, and then I ate it without even thinking about it. And the next day, I was preparing myself for the liturgy and for the Holy Communion. And I went to confession and I said, Father Nikan, this just sort of happened without even planning. And he said, Leah, what's an egg? Nothing. It's nothing. But if I allow you to do that, very soon you will add something else to that egg. Perhaps some sour cream. Thinking, oh, well, that's also nothing. You know? And very soon, in time, you will be adding and adding small things. So he taught me that no, you learn when you're given small things. So now, going back to that person, or to the whole nation, I'm so sorry. Now, how do you not get upset when you say, well, how does this person work with the spiritual father, whom I know she has? So that means it is at standstill. If small things like that are not covered by the spiritual discussion or talk or advice, then how do you proceed from that? Am I to admit that it's just hopeless for many people
No.
because of this set of rules?
I think the most important thing that the fathers teach us is we never, ever look at the other person and what they're doing. That's really important.
Or maybe go to confession to the same priest and he'll solve the problem.
We never look at what the other person is doing.
It's true.
Never, ever. And this is really hard because culturally, this is all we do. You know, that we're formed in this. You know, it may be, now it's very important. It's exactly as you say, and as Father Nikan taught you, because as the Lord said, he who is faithful in little will be faithful in much. Okay, but that's about my eating the egg during Lent and not being faithful in a little. That's about me. It's not about my neighbor. So and what that does, when we can free ourselves from looking at our neighbor and judging and criticizing our neighbor, then we have radical freedom. And what you brought up is so important, because we're enslaved and in chains by watching what our neighbor is doing. Probably it's only slightly crass, but there's a passage in Saint Dorotheus of Gaza when he's writing to his spiritual father. It's dialogues with or letters to his spiritual father, Saint Barsanuvius. He said, well, it's really hard because I have one brother who lives in the dormitory, and he comes and he pees on my head every night. Well, what do you do? But you see, the thing is, if we can not look at the other person and look at what they're doing and what they're not doing, and just be, because we're responsible ultimately only for ourselves. In that sense, I mean, there's another aspect of it. My brother's keeper, absolutely, but in the sense of we need to encourage and support one another. But does it? But one of the things that we can do is we can become so obsessed with what other people are doing or saying or thinking or how they're dressed or how they're acting or all of this other stuff that it becomes a great distraction. And what we're trying to do is remove the distractions from our life, because it's precisely those distractions that cloud that spiritual mirror, that spiritual awareness. And so the more that we can simply be conscious of ourselves and our own actions and responsibility, and take responsibility for our own actions, and let other people do what they're going to do. That's their issue. That's their problem between them and their spiritual father. Then we'll have greater and greater freedom to be compassionate.
That was gold. Pure gold. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
So what would it be wrong, for example, in her situation with some friend who's always, I guess, late or not showing up for her? I mean, I understand that you shouldn't let things bother you and you should forget the person, love the person, but would it be wrong to simply talk to the person and just say, I don't like it when you're late? And then if they say I can't be any other way, then you say, oh, okay. I mean, then
well, it's being honest.
Yeah, I mean, I guess what I'm asking is it, along with that, is it wrong sometimes to actually, I don't know if getting angry is the right way to put it, but to stop somebody in their wrongness, or try to stop someone in their wrongness if it's hurting you or someone else? Because if you simply just resolve, to accept the person, accept how they're, I'm going to forgive them, then they continue to do this wrong, and they might even do it to others. I mean,
well, this is the great dilemma of somebody who's in authority, for example. Now, if you correct somebody and you're enraged with passion, something else is going to come through. And it's not that I'm doing something wrong, is that this person is really angry at me. Just like your kids. It's not that I shouldn't have done this, it's that Mom is really angry with me. But if you cool down, and if you approach it dispassionately, and say, well, this is a problem that I've noticed. Can I, can we talk about it? You're going to have a whole different reaction of the person, and in other words, you're not going to put them into a defensive posture. You're approaching them openly, and therefore they're hopefully going to be more open. Of course, you have to use your own discernment whether that's going to be the case or not, and whether they're going to be able to hear you or not.
Well, that's where I'm wondering sometimes bluntness, or even like I don't want to use the word anger, but gets someone's attention, because sometimes you can come to them, and this has happened to me so many times, where someone's being destructive in some way, and I sit down and I tell them, they don't hear me. And then I get a little madder, later on down the road, and I tell them again, and they don't really hear me. And it's really not until I blow up, and then they kind of go, "Ooh, didn't know you were so mad." Oh, well, I've been telling you for the last. No, actually, no, I don't. Anyways, so I'm just wondering, is there I understand about controlling your, passion and all this kind of stuff, but I'm wondering if sometimes there's a time to be like...
Well, there is, and the scripture says, the psalm says, "Be angry, but do not sin." How do you
do that?
How do you do that?
How do you express anger in a way that's going to be constructive? Because it's meant to be constructive. Anger was given to us. It's a natural faculty of the soul to be constructive. So how do you do it? Have constructive anger. Jesus' anger at the money changers in the temple was constructive anger. Now, other people might not have seen it that way. And I'm sure he didn't go through and say, "Oh, please excuse me, please forgive me," and turn over the table and create chaos for the money changers. He did it with energy but not in a way that was necessarily that would have been. I think we would say not in a way that would upset his internal peace.
Yeah, I think I remember reading very recently, and I forgot which father, but it was very much that idea that it is possible to you can only truly confront someone and have a loving confrontation and so forth if you become selfless, if it's dispassionate. Because if it's not, it's about you and how you've been hurt.
That's right.
And if you're going to intervene with someone, it has to be 100% without any tinge of selfishness about their well-being and about the well-being of others. Right. I mean, otherwise, don't bother doing it.
Right. Yeah, no selfish agendas. I was going to end this at 3:30. We can go a little further, but I had a couple of other things that I wanted to present. Okay, so do you all see how the process of you all understand how resentments generate thoughts, right? And the process of dealing with the resentment, of coming to forgiveness, so that it comes to a point where you're able to deal with that person, or with the memory of that person, or with their name or something, without an emotional reaction. That's the depth of forgiveness. That's the depth of forgiveness. If it's been, there's always the question of whether it's wise to reconcile if there's been serious abuse. Sometimes you can, sometimes you can't. If it's not safe, then it's probably not a good idea. But at least for within yourself, you can let go. In other words, what this is, it's detaching from the resentment, so that you no longer have that as an element that is creating, or that is feeding into your own false self-definition. In other words, so that that victimhood is no longer a part of you. And what this does is it clears up, as we deal with the resentments in our lives, as we deal with, the baggage from our lives and unload it. What it does is it creates that a kind of inner stillness or inner spaciousness, so that you no longer are living in function of, on one hand, no longer living in function of these memories and of these resentments, but it also allows you to pray without these thoughts coming into your mind. It allows you to react to live with other people and react to other people, so that so that your reaction is not conditioned by a memory of how you were similarly treated before, and you're reacting to that instead of to the. In other words, if your reactions are out of proportion to the stimulus, then you know there's a problem with resentment buried deep down, because what you're doing is you're reacting to the old situation and not to the actual stimulus of that moment. Is this clear?
Not really that last part.
Like if if you've if somebody if somebody pushes ahead of you in line in the grocery store and you haul off and sock them, that's a reaction that's way out of proportion to to the offense. And what you may be reacting to is when somebody who knows pulled you out of line as a little kid and beat you up or something like that. It goes all the way, and these reactions can go all the way back. It's very interesting, psychologically. It can dredge up stuff from the time you were a kid. And so all of this is this kind of material that disturbs our ability to have inner stillness. The whole point of this retreat is about the ability to enter into stillness, and to learn how to control our thoughts. By dealing with resentments, by being watchful over ourselves and being watchful over our minds, we can let thoughts go. We don't have. They can present themselves to us, but we don't have to react to them. One of the images I like to use is a passion for, say, McDonald's hamburgers. Okay, at the monastery, we were 40 miles from the nearest McDonald's, up in the mountains. 40 miles. So, if you had a passion for McDonald's hamburgers, and say you had a radio hidden in your cell that you weren't supposed to be listening to, and they had an ad for McDonald's hamburgers, and so the monk starts thinking, oh, if I just had a McDonald's hamburger, oh, it's Lent, oh, the food was horrible, oh, I can't stand to look at cabbage one more time. If I just had that Big Mac, you know, and so there's a provocation. That's the ad, which is out of our control. Then the mind starts accepts the provocation. It starts considering it, and pretty soon, oh, McDonald's hamburger, nice and juicy and tasty and so what's happening is that your whole sensual apparatus is getting keyed off, right? And so pretty soon you're in the car hurtling down the mountain at 70 miles an hour to go get that McDonald's hamburger, right? So you've assented to the thought, and you decided to act on it, and so you go grab the keys and off you go. And the thing is, you can cut off the temptation at any time, even if it happens to be Good Friday and it's between services, you know. And you really want that Big Mac. Well, all temptations work the same way. If you think about it, temptations to lust, temptations to anger, temptations to actually despondency and pride and jealousy. You know, you get the image of a person who has something that you really want. You start turning it over in your mind, and you know, and you're turning over what they have and what you don't, and you start feeling sorry for yourself, and you start feeling pity for yourself, and you start feeling angry. Well, why don't I have that? Why does that person has more than I? Why does that person have that nice new BMW and I've got an old beat up Toyota, and on and on and on and on, and you know, and pretty soon you've whipped up yourself into a hatred of that person, and you're gonna get that person because they have this and you don't. But it's the provocation, it's the assent, it's the coupling, or it's the assent to you know, or it's this disturbance that where the thought has entered the mind. Then there's a coupling or converse, and then you consent to the thought. Say, I'm gonna do it. I'm gonna go get that hamburger. I'm gonna go beat that person up, or I'm gonna slander them on the internet or whatever. And then you do it. Well, the more frequently we go, we habitually allow ourselves to do this kind of thing. The more frequently we allow ourselves to do this thing, the more habitual it becomes, and the more automatic it becomes. So that you hear the McDonald's ad, and the next thing you know, you're pulling into the Golden Arches. Or you hear a person's name, and your fist is about to contact their face, or whatever it is, or you hear the person who slandered you, and then you're beating yourself up with what they said about you. It's this all, you know, the passions all work the same way, and so what the practice of inner stillness does, the practice of trying to quiet our mind and simply be present to God, is that it gives us practice in turning away our thoughts and letting the thoughts go. We can't stop our thoughts, but we don't have to pay attention to them. Now, our thoughts are like a television on in the background, right? You know, this constant stream of consciousness. You know, and some of those, you know, some of those things have images or words that are going to excite our passions. You know, think about the 30 screens in Big Buy. You know, You know, one is on the food channel, and there's another one, you know, that's on pornography, and there's another one that's on violence, and there's another one on what is it? What's the women's channel that just drives me nuts? The Living Channel or something?
Lifetime.
Lifetime. Oh.
You
I
know.
watch it. Pure emotional manipulation, pure undiluted emotional manipulation, and
Okay, here you go.
and so what we need to do is we need to first learn how to use the mute button, right? So that we're not listening to all of this stuff, and then we can find the off button, which means that the signal is still going into the box, but we're not paying any attention to it. We're not paying any attention to it. And one of the things that happens as you start a discipline of the Jesus prayer, in other words, sitting quietly. I'm not talking about using the Jesus prayer while you're doing other things. I'm talking about sitting quietly and saying the Jesus prayer in a focused, attentive manner, or just sitting quietly, being present to God. The Jesus prayer is helpful to do that. You'll have thoughts arise. But when you have thoughts arise and you can let them go during this time and use the Jesus prayer to kind of fling them away, you'll be able to develop a habit of that when the thoughts occur at other times. Because what happens when we begin a spiritual discipline like that is that all of the stuff rises to the surface. All of the memories, all of the resentments, everything, all the stuff that's stored in that storage room of our soul rises to the surface and needs to be dealt with. And it's good that it's good that it rises to the surface so that we can deal with it, but it's hard and it's painful sometimes. And it takes time. It takes months. Minimal is months. Sometimes it can take years, depending on the experience of a lifetime. But what's really important is to persevere in the discipline of sitting quietly and saying the Jesus prayer, or sitting quietly in the presence of God. Then all of these other things, these other levels, will eventually kick in. But the most powerful tool that we have in the spiritual toolbox, as it were, from the tradition, is the Jesus prayer and the practice of silence. It's precisely this that allows that restructuring of our mind, because what we're doing is we're allowing God in. And if we can allow God in, then God will do what God needs to do, as long as we let Him. Yeah.
Just one little thing following Colette's question about constructive anger. So is that only allowed to Jesus?
No.
So then what do you allow us to produce in the state of constructive anger?
Well, if it's destructive anger, we don't need it, right?
Yes, but constructive. You said there is anger that
Right.
could be defined as constructive.
Mm-hmm. And you have to discern whether your anger in a particular situation is constructive or destructive.
So if you want to overturn the tables at another cathedral, you to go ahead and do it.
That's kind of thing we need to deal with our spiritual father about, right?
Yeah, some of it you need to ask your spiritual father.
I am.
Yeah, yeah,
I am.
yeah, right.
Right.
And what I'm saying is you need to discern whether it's going to be destructive or whether it's going to be constructive. In other words, is it about you and some selfish agenda to control the other person's behavior, or is it about the other person so that they can do better?
Okay, you come to St. Nicholas Cathedral, not the one in Massachusetts, no, any St. Nicholas Cathedral, on the feast day of St. Nicholas, and you see that nobody remembered that. There isn't even an icon on the annalen. Nobody is singing any appropriate hymns. So what do? You start telling people like Matushka and others who can send a word to the altar, and then people start condemning you, saying that it's much worse to disturb parishioners who are preparing themselves to receive the holy gifts rather than allow something like that to be forgotten.
Well, you have to use your discernment.
Huh?
You have to use your discernment. What's going to be constructive and what's not. If it's before the service, and then that's right. If it's right before communion and you've just walked in, an hour late, and you see these things, then you just have to let it go. But see what I mean about using your discernment. What's going to be constructive and what's not.
Vladika, you were saying also with spending the time working on stillness, spending some quiet time, and we're also saying the Jesus prayer. I guess also you would recommend that working with your spiritual father in that as well, right?
Right, and the thing is that when you say the Jesus prayer, you gotta get a blessing to do that, and it's good that your spiritual father knows what you're doing. Important, and he may say no, you're not ready yet. Or he may say, sure, no more than 100 or no more than 200 or 500.
Or like 5 minutes or 10 minutes.
Or 5 or 10 minutes or 20 minutes.
Mm-hmm.
But usually a spiritual, this kind of, for people living in the world, you're not going to do an hour or two every day of the Jesus prayer. It's not like Essex where you do 2 hours in the morning and 2 hours in the evening. Maybe 20 minutes morning and evening, and that's quite enough. Now, and part of that is also to regulate how fast all of that emptying of the consciousness happens. For example, we had in my monastery when I was fairly new, I was told to celebrate the liturgy every day, so I did for 2 years. And what it did is it accelerated the spiritual growth rate of the monks, but it became way too much for me to be able to deal with because it demanded so much time, and they were going through so much, and their inner struggle became so intense that they couldn't deal with it, and neither could I. So we had to scale back. We had to turn down the heat a bit. And that worked, and that helped. And it's the same thing. You've got to realize how much you can deal with, because if you're a monk living in a monastery, then even then, for example, in Russian monasteries, and at least in some Russian monasteries, novices are forbidden to use the Jesus prayer. They're forbidden. Other monasteries, that's all there is. You go to a hermitage, and they don't have 18 books on their kleros to be able to do the full cycle of services. If they have the Aralogian and the Aktoikos, maybe or maybe just but they do most of their services on the rope. And they don't do all of the services. Well, you have to be very mature to be able to enter into a practice like that. Whereas the long services with all of the words. In other words, in dealing with the prayer of silence, what you're dealing with is non-conceptual prayer. That's that's a high level of spiritual development. That's what's called the third renunciation in Cashin. At first we need words and concepts, and we cling to the words and the concepts. But then eventually we need to go beyond that. But we have to be ready.
What are the third level and second level? And
First level is renouncing material. Well, let me read Cashin. Okay. St. John Cashin said, now something must be said about the renunciations which the tradition of the Fathers and the authority of Holy Scripture show to be three, in which each one of us ought to pursue and with all our zeal. The first is that by which in bodily fashion we despise all the wealth and resources of the world. The second is that by which we reject the erstwhile behavior, vices, and affections of soul and body. The third is that by which we call our mind away from everything that is present and visible, and contemplate only what is to come, and desire those things that are invisible. In other words, we first renounce and detach ourselves from any material things and relationships. Second is that we detach from our passions, and the third is that we detach from all concepts, all conceptual images.
And which father wrote that?
John Cashin?
Oh, Cassin. Okay.
Regarding conceptual images, does that literally mean you would develop control over your own mind to the point that you would blot out all manner of... I'm thinking of literally conceptual images of like shapes or things like that.
No, it's everything from shapes to words or sensations or thoughts or feelings. Or
So then your mind is completely drawn up. I mean to go back to this quote from St. Isaac, it's
you're completely
the
focused
presence
on
of
God.
Right.
You're completely focused on God. In other words, and it's it's not like you're focusing God as object. It's that you are in God and God is praying.
Right. Within
The
you.
Holy Spirit is praying within you.
So then that's why, that makes more sense now that St. Simeon was able to say that my brother is my life because he saw God so fully in the people that he was in relationship with.
No, he loved it. He loved it. Right?
that third level, you're in God and the Holy Spirit is praying
Within you.
within you.
It's St. Paul.
Like, you mentioned briefly the role of being the brother's keeper, and I'm curious how this relates to what you've said about detachment, especially with regard to like the idea you see so prominently in the literature of Dostoevsky, for instance, where one can become very aware of the responsibility one has for the sins of everyone around him or her. So, you know, at once you begin to recognize or identify with the sins of other people around you as somehow your own. And I'm wondering how this relates to what you're saying also about detachment.
I think what it is, that's a very kind of advanced form of compassion. Because ultimately we're only responsible for our own sins. Unless we've caused somebody else to sin. And then that's like a yoke around our neck. But the deeper we go, I mean, and the more free we've been freed from our selfish agendas, the more that we can love dispassionately. And and identify with the other. There's also an aspect too of the spiritual father taking on the sins of his disciples, which is quite a mystery. Yeah.
And I think part of the undertone of that is also, if for those who withdraw from the world, is how are they helping their brother? But I think they're actually helping us more than the people that are engaged, because without the prayers and intercessions of the monks,
Yeah.
the society would be 10 times worse.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, there's a wonderful saying that the angels are the light. The monks are the lights for the laity, and the hermits are the lights for the monks, but the angels are the lights for the hermits.
Say that one more time. Really good.
The monks are the light for the lights for the laity, for the lay people.
Mm-hmm.
The hermits are the lights for the monks, but the angels are the lights for the hermits.
Mm-hmm.
I recently had an experience that helped me kind of pinpoint the need for the dispassion that I don't have. I was at a Benedictine monastery, and an elderly monk had left the choir and was down in the congregation, kind of pacing back and forth, scouring, looking as if for a lost coin. Then I realized what it was. He was looking for talent, for someone who would bring up the gifts. And I caught his eye, and it was like, "You're looking for talent? That might be me," right? And he looked back at me with abject horror. "The dregs that you would be fit to bring up the gifts at our monastery, the likes of you, As I say, he was senile, right? So his face was an open book. He went away. He came back. Now he's looking at people in the pew ahead of me. There is talent. Down at the other end of the pew, he saw a well-heeled couple that he thought would reflect well on the community. And I could see the comparative difference. And then he disappeared. Then he came back. And now he's reaching out like for a piece of apple pie, rushing to let the couple know that he had chosen them. And I was afraid he might bump up against me or something. Bump up against me? He shoved me 12 feet down the pew up against the wall because he didn't notice that I was there, right? So I got to hear him announce to the couple that they were the lucky winners. My head was pressed up against his elbow. Now, did I resent him? No, I thought it was the funniest thing I ever saw. You know what I mean? But he wasn't exactly treating me with esteem.
Right.
But did I resent it? Of course not. He was senile, and it was so extreme that it was really very funny.
Mm-hmm.
By comparison, in other cases, I'm not so prepared to let go of the resentment or to think it's funny. And I think that's really interesting for me to wonder, why in some settings do I think that it's very important that I calibrate just what harm that person did me, that I'm forgiving. And that's where I would benefit from this grace of dispassion.
Mm-hmm. Well, we can all benefit from the grace of dispassion.
Yeah.
Yeah. Galena, last question.
I was very struck by what Layla said. Oh, don't see Layla. But she said, she was talking about how in former Soviet times there was a self-examination process that people went through to see whether or not they were, I guess, conforming to communist thought or whatever. And in this country, prior to situational morality and the I'm okay, you're okay morality of the 1970s, we also had, and were taught in school, a kind of self-examination. This is absent from our society, and we're exporting that absence abroad. People aren't supposed to admit they're not ill, or they're really late, or they don't care. And you're supposed to even feel better about yourself and get extra points or something like that for stepping on your brother. And so we are confronting a different kind of morality than we used to have, and yet resides in our memory for a certain age, and resides in the church because that's the way of the church. But the way of the world does come into the church, and that becomes very hard when we're confronting that interface. how do we deal with that interface? Is I think what she was saying, when it's not just politeness, it's not just little white lies to make people feel better or a veneer of something or another. It's situational morality.
Yeah. Well, I think it's a matter of being conscious. You know, it's a matter of being conscious of how we act and how we say and what we say and how we say it.
Discernment.
Yeah.
But it wasn't something that was just a Soviet thing. It was something that was an American thing too.
Sure.
Yeah.
Sure.
In a good way here.
Yeah. Thank you very much.
Thank
So,
you.
I hope this was useful. Yeah, we'll say. I want to say it. We'll finish with. You just turn on.
It is truly me, blessed of Theotokos, ever blessed and most blameless and mother of our God, more honorable than the cherubim, and beyond compare more glorious than the seraphim, who without corruption gave his birth to God the Word, the very Theotokos thee.